Want to give a quick shout out to all my patrons. Thank you so much for the continued support. And I am done. Okay, so I just finished up reading The Wall of Storms. This is the second book in the Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu, and I want to give you my unedited thoughts upon finishing this book, which was just right now. This book is so good. Oh my gosh, this book is good. This is a super, super easy 5 out of 5. And I feel like I'm saying this a lot this year, but this is one of the best books that I've ever read in my life. And I don't even know which book between the first and the second is better, and which is a crazy statement from me, considering I said that the first book in the Dandelion Dynasty, The Grace of Kings, is my second favorite book of all time. And that's after The Crippled God from Malazan. So for me to not know which one of these is better should speak how highly I think of this series to you. It's just incredible. I'm kind of like blown away by what I just read. And I've just been so desperate before I started reading this series to find another series that I felt like could compete with Malazan to perhaps go down as my favorite series of all time. And on the trajectory we're going, I mean, this is going to be challenging it. They're very different series, extremely different series. But I love them both so much for what they are. But this is just so consistently amazing. And if these last two books, this is a 4-book quartet, and if they last two go down like these two, then I don't know how it could be anything other than my favorite series of all time, because that would be 4 books that are, top 5, which is nuts to say. So let's, holding out hope. I have heard that the 3rd book dips a little bit in quality before the 4th book goes up. But, what do people know? They don't know what I like. The first book is rated below a 4 on Goodreads, which is not typical for these kind of more mainstream fantasy books. Typically, they have a higher score. And I loved it so much. I heard from a lot of people that the first and second books are so different that it would be hard to love both of them equally. And that, if you love the first one, you're probably going to think about a little bit lesser on the second one, and vice versa. But I just love them both so much, and they're very different. So, yeah, the superlatives that I have to say on this could not be, larger than life, and not be more large. I don't know. I'm mixing up my words here because I'm so excited about what I just read. So, I'll give you a very, very brief rundown on what this series is about and then kind of go into this book. So, essentially, this reads kind of like a historical fiction with heavy fantasy elements in it, especially this book than the first one. The second one has major fantasy elements, but it reads kind of like a history book, a very, very good history book. I love history books. But, it does these moments where most books would go from major plot point to major plot point with a large amount of time in between. This book does not. A very simple explanation of what I mean by this is you'll have the characters kind of hatching a plan, and in normal fantasy books, you would then see several chapters developed towards enacting that plan. In the Dandelion Dynasty, it probably happens on the next page. It's very quick in the way that things develop. Now, this one did slow down for the first, about the first half of the book, because it introduced some new characters, and it gave a lot more focus to some characters that had a very minor focus in the first book. And the arguable main character from the first book gets very little screen time in this one. So as the second book started, I was like, I am going to get that lesser quality from this. But eventually, I don't know when it snapped, but I was like, I love these new characters that I'm getting. The time spent to develop these characters was very worthwhile. And now I'm so deeply attached to them that I might like them more than I liked the initial set of characters that I got to follow. But it was very slow plotting. It was like, the first book ends and it feels like it could have been a standalone. And I mentioned in my review that I don't know where this next book's going to go. And I don't look up things before I read them. I go in completely blind. And I just didn't know where it was going to go. And I still didn't know where it was going to go a decent amount through this book. And I got a hint of it as I was reading, even before I read this book, as I'm flipping through the initial pages, there are different maps than the first book. And I don't want to ruin anything for you, but I was like, oh, that's where we're going with this, but then it never happens. But eventually it does, and the plot greatly expands, and then you start understanding, oh, here's what it's going to be about. This is a major conflict, and now we're going to go get it in the second half of the book. But this book is about 900 pages long. So, you got, 400 or so pages of setup and about 400 or so pages of pretty intense action. That's a great kind of pacing of a book for me, even though it goes from quite slow to quite fast. I thoroughly enjoyed it. This book series in general is about the Dandelion Dynasty. The first book is about this guy who tries to take over the kingdom, and it mimics real life events from ancient China with, I believe it's the Han Dynasty. I didn't know much at all about the Han Dynasty beforehand, so nothing was ruined for me. And I don't know if it would have been ruined anyways, because I'm sure there's enormous differences, and the fantasy elements, like I mentioned, are pretty intense. It's not like magic wielding, but there are gods that do this really fun kind of ancient Greek type of thing where they are kind of in the background, and every now and then they come out and they're talking to each other, and they're talking about, their favorite human and why they're backing them and what they're doing to try to help them along. It's this really fun commentary that you constantly get from this. It's a really entertaining, backdrop that we get to this. But there are also, these giant magical beasts that can do amazing things that the humans interact with and can use to their advantage. That's most of where the fantasy comes from on here, is the huge beasts and the creations that these humans can make. I mean, it feels like a book from ancient China, but they're flying around in these airships and doing these different things that they've done that make sense in the world that it is, and it feels like it makes sense, but it is very fantasy oriented. But yeah, so the second book just takes off and goes in this new direction, and then it even introduces new characters at the halfway point and does some major point of view shifting. And I fell in love with these characters as well for very different reasons. But when the final battle and the final sequence starts coming up, I truly had no idea how it was going to go. Many surprises, just wonderful, wonderful stuff from top to bottom. And I leave this book just so excited to go into the third book. More excited, I think, than I was in the first book. Because this doesn't feel like a standalone. It's very clear that what's kind of being teed up for this third book, even though this one didn't feel like it had any sort of middle book syndrome, it did kind of finalize the plot, but then it makes that promise of what is to come down the line, and I just can't wait to get there. The writing quality somehow, even though this book only came out a year after the first book, feels like it improved in pretty much every way. The characters were better developed, in part because it slowed down and I was able to feel them better, but the prose itself kind of rolled off better. It made me feel deeper emotional feelings about these characters and the events that were happening, and just in general, it felt like a better produced plot, a lot slower, but a better produced plot, better characters, just so many positive things about the way that this was written. I did also love the new magical elements that get implemented. I do not want to ruin at all what they are, but in that second half of the book, they come hot and they come heavy, and it's very fun to find out what's going on. So yeah, this is a perfect book. I don't get to say that very often, and it's amazing. I do understand though that this is certainly not for everybody. The way that it's written, I feel like it really appeals to those that like historical books. If you've ever found yourself really getting into biographies, or I'm not talking like history textbooks that you read in school. I mean, fun history books, but the way that they're kind of plotted out, it feels like that's what this is. And for me, it's just this amazing blend, because this is at its heart a historical book, but on its other side of the heart, this is a political thriller. That almost puts like A Song of Ice and Fire to shame in how good the political aspects of this are. And now, I mean, no disrespect to A Song of Ice and Fire. That series is one of my favorite series that I've ever read, and I suspect that it will always remain that way. It's got a very special place in my heart. And, you know, it's also one of my favorite series. You know, so I don't mean that in a negative way. I think A Song of Ice and Fire is better than this book in certain ways, but I love the political side of A Song of Ice and Fire. And I said, you know, I've been looking for books that have that sort of feel to it, you know, not just the epic fantasy that both of these books are, but the constant back and forth and changing of who's in charge, and, you know, not caring when people get offed, and bringing in new people, bringing in a new cast, you know, going in these different directions, you know, plotting and deceiving, and all these amazing aspects combined with that historical type of writing. It's just perfect for me. So, but, you know, if you're the type of person that, you know, would kind of dread reading like some historical biography and some of these things, then maybe this wouldn't be for you. And clearly it's not, because this book series is not, even though it's popular, it's won like all the major fantasy awards. It's not, you know, one of the titans of the fantasy genre. And I don't think it's one of those book series that's going to get incredibly more popular as time goes along. And, you know, nobody's going to sit there and claim that this is going to be, you know, unanimously one of the top fantasy series. I will certainly shout that from the rooftops, especially if these final two books can kind of hold up, even kind of like a sliver of what these first two were. But, you know, the general consensus, you're going to have some people that say that, but most people aren't going to include that in the conversation. So, yeah, I don't have much more to say. Go get this book. Go pick up this series. Enjoy. But understand what it is and what it is not. But if you're like me, then you've just found another incredible series that will just capture the imagination, that I will never forget. If I never reread this book again, I would remember so many intimate details of this till the day that I died. And I can't say that for a lot of series. You know, a lot of books that I've even read this year, some of the details are starting to get fuzzy. And as I go on a couple years, I'll forget almost everything about them. Certainly not here. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, happy reading to you. Thanks again to my patrons, with a special shout out to my Ascendant tier patrons: Anna, Ben, Brian, CJ, Donute, Darren, Jamie, Maria, Michael Sugarman, My Book is Lit, Nev's Book Channel, Romeo Mike, Ron Reich, Russell, Ryan L., and Sky.